Can everyone hear me okay? Okay, good. I want to start by welcoming everyone and thank you for attending. My name is Kristen Peacole, and I'm the Assistant Director at ALA's Office for Intellectual Freedom, or OIF. It's my pleasure to introduce today's webinar, IF Live, to explore the beautiful new Intellectual Freedom Manual. Throughout the program, we encourage you to use the chat box at the lower right hand of your screen to discuss the topics raised, share feedback, and also raise questions. This chat is being monitored, and your questions will be saved and brought forward during the Q&A session at the end. But you're also welcome to save your questions until then if you'd like. I also want to let our attendees know that today's session is being recorded. The recording includes both the audio, the slides, and the chat. If you have any questions or concerns about this, please get in touch with me after the session. Thanks to ALA Editions, we have a bright, new, shiny copy of the manual to give away at the end of the webinar. You must be present to claim the prize. Now I'm delighted to introduce Trina Magi, library professor at University of Vermont and editor of this edition of the Intellectual Freedom Manual. Trina's leadership in raising awareness about the USA Patriot Act led to the introduction of the first bill in Congress to reform the law. In 2008, she led a successful effort to establish a new library patron privacy law in Vermont. She has given dozens of presentations to community groups and library conferences, published a host of articles, and won 8 awards for her scholarship and advocacy. And she has served on intellectual freedom committees at the state, regional, and national levels. Welcome, Trina.
Thanks, Kristen, and welcome to everyone who's here with us today. We're so glad you joined us. For decades, the ALA Intellectual Freedom Manual has been an essential tool for librarians as they work to protect intellectual freedom. And we wanted to make sure this edition was even more practical and user-friendly. So before embarking on the project, I talked with lots of librarians across the country about their needs. And that led to a major reorganization of the book. And so we're very excited to share with you the results of that and give you a little peek inside the new edition. So first, I want to just tell you a little bit about that new organization. Here are some things that are new about the 9th edition. It's now arranged by topic instead of by official ALA document, and it covers 9 issues that librarians told us were most important. And we learned that librarians also needed guidance in writing policies for their libraries. So we've added lots of checklists that will tell you what policies you should have at your library and what those policies should include. I think the 2 things that probably make librarians most nervous are book challenges and visits from law enforcement. So the book includes practical step-by-step guidance for how to deal with both of those issues. And it also includes some new content on copyright. And to accommodate all of that new content, we decided to remove the historical essays that had appeared in earlier editions. Those essays are still very important, so we're publishing them in a companion volume that you can purchase to go with your lovely Intellectual Freedom Manual. So let's take a look at the 9 issues that are covered. Again, these are the issues that librarians told us they have questions about, and that would be helpful to them to get information about. And let's look and see what you would see for each of these issues if you turned to one of the chapters. Each chapter starts with what we call an issue at a glance page. And this is actually several pages of very easy to read, quick bullet points that will get you quickly up to speed on the issue. So you can see here it starts by outlining the key concepts. And then it talks about what the law says about that issue. And then it proceeds to tell you a couple tips for writing policy in your library. That's followed by some special points that will be useful for different types of librarians, academic librarians, public librarians, and school librarians. And then finally, the issue at a glance section will give you a referral to learn more about the topic, point you to some websites or other resources. and finally offer you some questions for reflection that you could use for staff development, or if you're teaching a class, or just want to think give some reflection to the topic. Now, the issue at a glance pages are followed by official ALA policy statements about that issue. So here on this page, you're seeing the Diversity and Collection Development Statement that's been approved by ALA Council. After those official ALA policy statements, each chapter includes what we're calling a deeper look. So on this page, you're seeing a legal essay about the law regarding rating systems. And this would give you a deeper, more close look at the issue. Now here's an example of a different part of the book. This is showing you an example of one of our policy checklists, creating policy for your library regarding the use of meeting rooms and exhibit spaces. So you can see
Trina,
it gives you...
Can I interrupt you for a second? Can I just have you speak a little bit louder, please?
I will. Thank you. Is that
Thank
better?
you.
Okay. So this is an example of a policy checklist, and this one focuses on meeting rooms and exhibit spaces. And you can see it just gives you a nice, easy-to-use list of things to consider as you write and prepare policy for your library. And here's an example of another deeper look section in the guidelines for how to respond to law enforcement requests at the library. So again, it tells you, what to think about before a visit should happen, and then it will proceed to give you some guidance about what to do along the way. Now, there's much, much more in the book, and I'm so lucky to have here with me today some of the people who contributed to this edition of the manual, and they're going to talk about some other important and useful features. Our first guest is Martin Garnar, and he served as my wonderful assistant editor. Thanks for being here, Martin. You served on the Intellectual Freedom Committee and the Committee on Professional Ethics. And those committees generate official ALA policy statements, and most of those are printed in the manual. But we're wondering, why on earth would a practicing librarian care about those statements? How would she or he use them?
Well, thanks, Trina. I'm happy to talk about that. Yes, there are a lot of statements that are produced by these committees, and ultimately they do go to council for approval. Before we talk about how they could be used and why people should care about them, I just want to go through the different levels of what's available. You might have a top-level statement like, say, the Code of Ethics or the Library Bill of Rights. And these, I'm curious to know if participants could either raise their hands or say yes in the chat, how many folks know if their libraries have adopted either the Code of Ethics or the Library Bill of Rights as policy statements for their libraries? I know that we have the Code of Ethics is in our faculty handbook, and the Library Bill of Rights is in our collection development policy. And so even though I work for a private university, we still follow, that's even religiously affiliated, we actually follow the same principles that are out there for the profession. And the committees serve as the guardians for these statements so that they keep them up to date, and they help issue additional statements to make them make sure that their relevance is obvious for people as new issues arise. And so that's where the next level of statement would come up. Interpretations. And I'm choosing to feature the copyright interpretation because it's the first time that the Code of Ethics has an interpretive statement, and that's the committee I'm currently chairing. And we were really happy to work to contribute this so that the manual could have some more information about copyright. As Trina mentioned before, this was one of the issues that people had said they were really interested in getting more guidance on. And while there was a very brief statement about intellectual property in the Code of Ethics, we felt it was time to expand things to talk about what librarians need to know, and actually it talks about responsibilities for our level of understanding about copyright. It talks about our educational responsibilities for our patrons. So it's trying to get a little bit more detailed. And then finally, there are policy documents that come out of the committees that are not approved by council but still help out. Here's an example of a Q&A document. We have lots of these, both coming from the Intellectual Freedom Committee and the Committee on Professional Ethics. And this will let us get into some of the nitty-gritty details and also get into perhaps more timely issues that we can update on a regular basis. So now that you have perhaps a better sense of what all of these the different levels of documents, why should people care? Why should we care about these things? Number one, these documents help spell out what we like to talk about being the North Star principles for the library profession. When we have statements about censorship, about copyright, about privacy, about access, what does our profession as a whole believe? These are embodied in the Bill of Rights and the Code of Ethics. If you are facing challenges, if you are having questions and you are looking for policy language that can help put things into good words for you, you can turn to the manual and you can get great examples of language that you can use. Having served on those committees for a number of years and with many of my co-presenters, we can all tell you the hours, if not weeks and days, that go into crafting this very, very, very precise language. And we do it carefully because we want to make sure that it can stand up as model language for you to use and adopt in your own policy statements. So this is why you can why you should care about what's out there. And again, using them as references, using them to be the basis of your own policy statements, pointing to them when questions come up. This is why we have assembled things together, and especially why under Trina's guidance, we rearrange things so that they're arranged by topic, so that when you have an issue, when you have something that's coming up with, say, minors in the library, you can go right to that section and see all the pertinent documents, all the policy statements. I think that's all I want to say at this point, Trina, about how we can use the statements, but I'm happy to chime in as needed.
Sure, thanks very much. It occurs to me, too, another good use of them is if you need to educate a new board member, or a new colleague in some other part of the institution. It's just a great way to give them something readable and relatively brief to get them up to speed.
Well, and even as you're pointing out in the issue at a glance, it's a great way to start for staff trainings or for board trainings so that people know why we care about these things, and they can use those reflective questions as discussion starters so people can really feel versed with the questions.
Exactly. Thanks again. We also have with us Deborah Caldwell Stone from the Office for Intellectual Freedom. Hi, Deborah. Welcome.
Hi, Trina. Thank you. I'm glad to be here today with everyone.
Good. The new edition has a number of essays about laws that are relevant to library operations. So we're wondering, Deborah, why is it important for librarians to know something about the law, and what kinds of topics are addressed in those essays?
Well, there's a number of reasons that librarians should have a basic understanding of the laws and court opinions that are relevant to intellectual freedom. And one is the fact that many of ALA's intellectual freedom policies actually draw on the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, and court opinions for some of the principles expressed in those policies. And you can see that here, this interpretation of the Library Bill of Rights on access to digital information and networks references a number of court opinions that set forth principles concerning the First Amendment, access to information. And so we've tried to illuminate that with some of the essays in the manual this year. And one of the most fundamental principles is the right to receive information in the library. In fact, it's probably the very foundation for intellectual freedom in the library. And so we have a number of essays that address that right to access information in the library and affiliated topics that draw on that principle. For example, user behavior rules. There is a First Amendment right to access the physical library, to step into the library, but what kind of limits are there on that right? What kind of user behavior rules can a library put in place consonant with that First Amendment right? And similarly, we have essays on what First Amendment principles apply to the removal of library materials, the minors' rights to access information, and a very important essay on access to meeting rooms and exhibit spaces, which is an area where many libraries have actually been sued, and so is very important for librarians to know about. Another reason that's important to know something about the law is many libraries, public libraries, are actually under a legal obligation to provide this access under the First Amendment and other court opinions. And so they really need to understand these legal obligations. We also have a number of essays that talk about obligations that are imposed on public libraries in particular, and school libraries as well, based on statutory law, like the Children's Internet Protection Act, for example, or copyright. Again, that's a body of law that is primarily based on statutes rather than on constitutional law or court opinions. And then, of course, we have expanded a little bit our coverage of privacy and confidentiality in libraries so that librarians have a thorough understanding of the principles involved and how they can respond to demands for information from law enforcement and other third parties. Of course, librarians who work for private institutions are not obligated in the same way as public libraries or public school libraries to comply with some of these legal obligations, but overall, they set forth principles that can be an example of good practice related to intellectual freedom and can kind of be a North Star when those private institutions are crafting their intellectual freedom policies. And before I close, I'd like to point out another new tool in the manual that I find really helpful and exciting. Is the fact that we've now included call-out boxes that highlight certain legal principles, define certain legal terms, or serve as finding tools or pointers to other essays in the manual that will help with an understanding of the legal principles involved or the requirements imposed upon a library by the law. This is important, and certainly one of the big issues for libraries is they want to avoid liability. And these essays outline the principles that need to be thought about so that when they are crafting policy and procedure, they set up a system and policy procedures so that they can they have the least risk possible for being sued.
That's great. Thanks, Deborah, for going over that with us. I guess we should make it clear, too, here that these essays do not serve as a substitute for good legal counsel, right?
Absolutely, and thank you for bringing that up. And in fact, if you peruse the manual, you'll find from time to time statements that these are not legal opinions, nor are they legal advice. They're really just outlines of legal information. They are means of acquainting everyone with the basic principles that underlie the body of law, so that when they work with their library's legal counsel, they are better informed on crafting policy. It's always important to consult with an attorney because everybody's situation is different. The facts are always different in every case. How the law applies to those facts will be different in every case. And only an attorney engaged by the library who is charged with representing the library's interest is best positioned to tell you how the law applies in that case.
You know, I find these essays really helpful in terms of just kind of understanding whether it's time to call an attorney. You know, you can kind of look at one of these essays and say, oh boy, there's a lot more to this issue than I thought, so it's time to bring in some expertise. I think they can also be useful, again, in educating administrators or others who are maybe not so familiar with library law and don't realize that there are some legal obligations. So I think they
Yes.
can be very useful tools for that.
Yes, and I think it's very important to make sure that trustees are aware of these legal obligations that affect libraries, because after all, they are the body. Trustees, the library board, are charged with legally operating the library, and ultimately they will be the responsible party if anything happens, and so they should have a good understanding of what the law requires.
Many thanks, Deborah. Appreciate your going through that with us.
Thank you.
Next, I want to welcome Helen Adams. Helen spent many years as a school librarian and is still a prolific teacher and writer on all things information or intellectual freedom. Welcome, Helen.
Hi, Trina.
Hi. You know, Helen, we heard in our discussions with librarians that previous editions of the manual sounded like they were focusing a lot on public libraries. So we've added a lot of useful content for school librarians in this edition. Could you tell us a little more about what's inside for school librarians?
Certainly. As Trina described, there are 9 major issues, such as access to library resources and internet filtering, and copyright's been mentioned several times, privacy. All of these issues, all 9, are really relevant to school librarians. Each issue has a separate brief section that's labeled especially for school librarians. And let's take a look at one of those. This is from the chapter on censorship, challenged resources, and internet filtering. And you notice at the bottom it says especially for school libraries. So what kind of information is in these bulleted sections? Well, the first bullet here really talks about court decisions, and it explains the difference between how a school board has control over materials used by all students in the curriculum and how that's different from materials in a school library collection that are used freely and individually chosen by students. Another bullet in this section focuses on filtering beyond the requirements of the Children's Internet Protection Act. These types of statements really tie nicely back to the sections that Deborah talked about. What does the law say? So that helps school librarians understand more how the law is involved in school libraries and what are our legal responsibilities. I think before any school librarian completes a career, most of them will face a challenge sometime in their career, and if not a formal challenge, at least an expression of concern or some type of oral complaint. And what this manual has is step-by-step challenge advice. First, for oral complaints and expressions of concern, step-by-step what to do, and then for formal written requests, and we're going to take a look at what that section looks like. Notice that the steps are numbered, which makes them easy to follow. And if you are facing a formal written request for reconsideration, these steps will not only guide you, what should I do next, but they will also give you the confidence that you haven't forgotten to do something that you really should have. One advantage that I've found in the manual is that the information can be located and read very quickly. This formal written request for reconsideration steps is about 3 pages long. And so if you are confronted by a situation where you need immediate information, this is the place to go. Additionally, in the manual, there is a request for reconsideration of library resources sample form, and that too is new. Filtering is just a huge issue in school libraries. And in the chapter on censorship, there are 4 sections with information devoted to internet filtering. And of special interest to school librarians would be an essay called Filtering, What Are School Libraries Doing? And you're getting just a screenshot of the first page in that section. And the essay includes a description of how restrictive filtering can affect students. And this is just great information that could be shared with administrators and tech directors and the school board and parents, as well as staff. Equally important in this particular essay is a list of strategies that school librarians can use to advocate for the lessening of the impact of filtering. Pat Scales is really well known as an advocate for minors' First Amendment right in school libraries. And she has shared in the Intellectual Freedom Manual a new essay titled Intellectual Freedom and Young People. And in this 2 to 3 page essay, Pat has provided lots of examples for ways that we as librarians can teach students, even young children, about their First Amendment rights, including the freedom to read, and then their corresponding responsibilities to protect their freedom of speech and speak up if they feel that their rights are being denied. So that is a great essay that, from all of her years of experience, Pat is sharing with us. Lastly, most school libraries do not have a privacy policy. And as Trina mentioned, the new manual has a privacy and confidentiality policy checklist. I don't have a screenshot for the checklist, but that checklist can be used to create a policy, a privacy policy, that will help protect students' privacy while they're using the library and the confidentiality of their library records. This is a really important need in the school library world. And when you look at this final slide, you can see all of the new things that have been added specifically for school librarians. And I hope that the new manual will become your go-to source for intellectual freedom advice in the future.
Thanks, Helen. Next, we have with us Sarah Houghton. Sarah is a director of a public library. Welcome, Sarah.
Thanks a bunch. I contributed 2 short chapters about internet filtering to the manual. Somehow I've become the internet filtering expert over time as I've done a lot of work with them. The interesting part for me about this manual is that when you're faced with an intellectual freedom, you can kind of just flip to the section and get the tools you need to address the problem. And a lot of this is stuff that's scattered all over the web, or you might find in a few different places on ALA's website or individuals' websites. And to me, as a library director, this manual is just a great thing to have on the shelf to grab and just pull out easy answers. We just had to revise our policy about our community bulletin boards, for example, and there's information in here that would have helped with that. Looking at the filtering section, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, that's okay, Sarah. I was just going to ask you a question about your the contributions you made to the manual regarding the filtering that that Helen already mentioned briefly. Can you tell us what you covered in those essays and why filtering is still a hot topic for librarians?
Great, thanks. Even though filters really haven't changed technology-wise for about 10 years, we haven't really seen the technology evolve at all. Filtering companies still make a brisk dollar with libraries of all sorts in the US and in other countries too.
And I think that's why it's still a hot topic, is that with SEPA and with certain local expectations that content be filtered, it's an issue that we're still facing in our profession on an ongoing basis. My underlying point in the chapters that I write is that the filtering technology is not infallible, and to me that changes the tone of the discussion quite a bit. It's not a discussion about should children look at naked pictures or not, or should children or even adults have access to different political views or different religious views on the internet at the library. It turns that discussion into a does this technology work or not discussion. And statistically speaking, the technology only works about 80% of the time. About 20% of the time it will overblock, which means it will block something that should be allowed through because it's constitutionally protected, and per the settings of the filtering software, it should be allowed through, but it's blocked accidentally or erroneously. And then about 20% of the time, stuff that shouldn't get through based on the filter settings gets through anyway. And that's just for text content. That's about an 80% accuracy rating for text content. Once we start looking at multimedia, whether it's images, video, other forms of content that we find online, the accuracy goes way, way, way down. What you find is that you could actually flip a coin and have a better accuracy rating than the filtering software has. So to me, that alters the discussion dramatically toward does the technology work. And fortunately, I've been able to, in the last 2 libraries I've worked in, have that conversation turn out successfully, where it wasn't an ethical discussion anymore, it was a technology discussion. One of the disturbing things that we find in libraries that do implement filtering software is that they over-implement it extensively. And so Deborah has written quite a bit about this, about appropriate implementation and what levels of filtering need to happen, what kind of categories need to be filtered and at what level. And unfortunately, in most libraries of all sorts, all throughout the country, we see people over-implementing, which means content is accidentally getting blocked that really shouldn't be. And that's where most of the lawsuits in libraries come from regarding filtering. It's overblocking. Libraries don't get sued for underblocking. The other issue to consider with filters in libraries is what I call the big brother factor, that the knowledge that there are filters on the computers, that people feel they're being watched when they come into your library to use your technology. Studies show time and time again people behave very differently when they feel they're being monitored or watched, and so users might avoid accessing sites that they think might be blocked, or if something is blocked, they're not going to come up to the librarian and ask for it to be unblocked because they think, well, the librarian has said that this is terrible, so it must be terrible. I don't want to admit that I wanted to access them. And so for me as a library director, and also for someone who's been advocating for access to information online for, well, my entire career, I ask myself all the time about this, how many of our library users walk out of our libraries without the information they wanted or needed because the technology was restricting access and they were too ashamed or embarrassed to ask for it to be unblocked. And I think the answer to that, just anecdotally, is a lot. I think we have a lot of users not getting access to what they should legally have access to. And so I think that our communities should try to work together to find ways to educate our users, whether that is our own staff or parents in the community, educators, political stakeholders, to figure out a way to support our community members to be fully functional digital citizens and not giving them a substandard version of the internet through our libraries, which is what I'm afraid is happening today. So in my heart of hearts, I'm hopeful that this is one of those weird fads that will pass in the next 5 to 10 years and that these will all go away.
Sarah, thanks for walking us through that. It seems to me there's lots of good information in the manual to help people with this prickly issue, because I know it is prickly for a lot of people, but you've given us a lot of good information on whether or not the filters work, which can be really helpful if you're trying to, again, educate your administrators or board members. We've also provided some good information about whether you're even required to filter, because people are sometimes misunderstanding that. And then finally, the manual also includes a little list of things you can do if you've tried your best and you're still being required to filter. Well, what can you do to minimize the negative impacts? So there's lots of good information in there to help librarians. Thanks a lot, Sarah. Next up is Nanette Perez. Nanette works at the Office for Intellectual Freedom at ALA. Welcome, Nanette.
Hi, Trina. Thank you for having me.
Sure. Nanette, the book ends with 2 chapters that are very, very practical. What's included in those, and how will librarians find them helpful?
Okay, so the last 2 chapters of the Intellectual Freedom Manual are titled Communicating About Intellectual Freedom and Where to Get Help and Get Involved. Let's talk about the chapter Communicating About Intellectual Freedom first. Librarians often need help figuring out how to talk about intellectual freedom, especially in a crisis situation. This chapter provides easy-to-use bulleted lists of tips for working with the media, creating messages, choosing spokespeople, and dealing with negative publicity and controversy. As you will see on the screen, I have provided a few snippets of the few sections in this chapter. After reading this chapter, librarians will feel prepared to handle a public and media relations program, deal with crises and controversies that may arise, and more effectively lobby your elected officials. And in case you were wondering, the tips we share on lobbying are designed to work at the local, state, or federal level. The last chapter, Where to Get Help and Get Involved, co-authored by yours truly and the fabulous host of this webinar, Trina Magi. Am I right? Yes, I am. This chapter provides readers with information, assistance, or ways to help protect intellectual freedom. Here I share with you our Take Action section, which provides a bulleted list of ways you can help protect intellectual freedom. The chapter also provides advice on how to get help if you're faced with a challenge. I've created a slide here for you to refer back to if ever you need help. And since I have your ears, I wanted to say that OIF is here for you 100% when facing a challenge to library materials. Any information you provide to us is kept confidential. I cannot stress that point enough. We will hold your hand through the challenge. Actually, more specifically, Kristen Picol will be holding your hand through any challenge you have. Also included in this chapter is a robust list of intellectual freedom resources, including publications and online resources, ALA committees and awards, and of course, educational and public awareness programs like Banned Books Week, which will take place September 28th through October 3rd this year, and of course, Choose Privacy Week, which took place recently, May 1st through 8th to be exact. And as an aside, since I had been billed as the beauty and brains behind Banned Books Week, I wanted to share with you this year's poster, which is featured on the left-hand side of the screen. The graphic to the right is for Choose Privacy Week. I hope this answers your question, Trina.
Yeah, thanks, Nanette. That's great. So there's, again, lots of tips to go to here if something happens at your library and you're wondering how to deal with the media or community members. The manual is your place to turn to get advice on that and to get some good tips. Or, as Nanette says, ideas about who you can call to help you, because there is plenty of help available.
Yes,
so we are going to take your questions next, but I also thought by now you are probably wondering how you can order your copy of the manual. So I want to be sure to put this slide up on the screen in case you can't stay for the Q&A period. So you can either contact the ALA store online or by phone. There's a toll-free number there. And ALA is offering a generous discount for members of the association and also for webinar attendees. So you'll see there's a coupon code at the bottom of this screen. So you'll want to use that to get your discount and do that soon because it's not going to be here forever. So that's how you can order your copy. And I'll leave that screen up while we begin to field your questions. So I think Kristen is going to put together for us a list of the questions that have come in during the webinar. But if you have one now, feel free to put it in the chat box. I do want to remind you that we are recording the webinar. So this is not the place or the time to include anything confidential that you wouldn't want to have shared widely. So let's see. Kristen, do you have questions for us?
Yes, Trina. The first question I sent to you is, do you think this volume will be useful as a teaching tool in a college class on information ethics and policy, or as a text, or just a resource for the instructor?
Oh, great question. Actually, I think it would be a good textbook. That's one of the reasons we included those questions for reflection at the end of every issue chapter. It includes 2 or 3 or 4 questions that kind of make you think. And those could serve as really excellent writing prompts for students to think about. Or you could use it in professional development applications as well, getting your staff to think about them. But I would also say that teachers of library science will want to also get the supplement that's being published this summer called A History of ALA Policy on Intellectual Freedom. And that's going to include all the historical essays that describe how these official ALA statements came to be. And that's a marvelous read to find out about the debates in the profession. So I think both of those together are really good resources for teachers.
Okay, another question that we have is that the statements that Martin talked about are all available on the ALA website. Why publish them in print form?
That's a good question as well. Well, we want this book to really be a very easy to use book. So, you know, when a crisis emerges or a problem comes up, you know, I've been in that situation. You want to just grab one resource really quickly, turn to it, and know that you're going to have what you need all in one place. You know, it's easy to think you'll remember to go here and there and somewhere else, but, you know, when you're under a stressful situation, that's hard to do. So I think it's great that everything is packaged together here.
Another point with a print resource as well as having things online is keeping in mind the digital gap between not everybody having internet availability. If you're a student just learning about things, or if you are a patron, maybe you want to have copies available for your your library trustees. It can be really helpful to have print copies for people who may not be comfortable using the internet.
That's exactly right, Kristen. Also, it serves as an archival function. You know, I mean, it's hard to keep track of web pages. This makes sure that our profession's most important policy statements are preserved for a longer period of time. And also, I should point out, we've made the manual larger this year. It's in a 8.5 by 11 format. And we did that deliberately so that you could easily photocopy a statement to share with a board member or a community member. So it's much easier to use in that way, too.
The next question that we have is there a reference in the manual about the Kramer case in the 90s and its impact, or perhaps in the historical notes?
Yeah, Deborah, can you help us out on that one?
Yes, I can address that. That basic essay that Teresa Camara, the General Counsel for the Freedom to Read Foundation, made major contributions to the manual, and one of them is that basic foundational essay on the right to receive information and the right to access the library. And it's part of the discussion of public forum analysis. The court's interpretation of the public library as a public forum where you have a First Amendment right to enter the library and to use its resources. So the Kramer case is thoroughly reviewed in both the foundational essay and the essay on user behavior rules, and can provide basic information and understanding of that case for both practitioners and students alike.
Wonderful. Debbie has just asked a question. Has anyone ever conducted an intellectual freedom workshop for the general public at the public library, and what was the turnout? Nanette, as you often hear about different Banned Books Weeks programs and programming that comes your way. Have you ever seen or heard anything like that?
Sorry, can you repeat the question again?
Sure. It is, has anyone ever conducted an intellectual freedom workshop for the general public at a public library? What was the turnout like?
And you're talking specifically about Banned Books Week?
Yeah, well, I was, but intellectual freedom in general for the general public?
Well, okay, so in previous years we've hosted a Banned Books readout, in-person readout, and which a readout, sorry, Banned Books Week is helps the community understand, or it spotlights challenges that occur throughout the country, and that's a way to engage the general public. And when we have events like that where we feature local celebrities or even celebrity authors, we've had people, like 300 people attend.
Wow, that's great.
Yes, and I've done a number of presentations on specific intellectual freedom topics. For example, on the Patriot Act for the League of Women Voters. I've done public presentations on book challenges during Banned Books Week, and the response sometimes is small but enthusiastic. 20 people or so, up to up to 300 sometimes. I know that one Patriot Act workshop I did had hundreds in the audience. So I think it's a matter of interest and timing on some topics, but I know that there are members of the community who would very much be interested in a presentation like that.
I think Deborah's right. It's critical to time it to something that's in the news. So, watch for those opportunities.
When our library in West Bend went through a challenge, Deborah and Angelo came to up north to Wisconsin and put on a really great Freedom to Read workshop, read-in. We had people reading in all over the library and celebrating their freedom to read, and they talked about the First Amendment, and it was a really great workshop to the public, and that raised a lot of awareness for that. All right, the next question that we have, does the manual address the sharing of personal information of students with third parties? Under the Family Education Rights Privacy Act, FERPA, schools are obligated to notify parents of their rights to opt out of the directories maintained by schools. When a parent opts out, he or she restricts third-party access to his or her children's information, such as address, date of birth, which can be used without authorization to breach your children's and your family's privacy. I apologize for reading that.
Deborah wrote a really excellent expanded essay on the law regarding privacy and confidentiality in libraries, and in that essay she talks about various federal statutes that impact this issue, including the FERPA law. And she also has a very nice section in that essay about third parties and the collection of library patron data. So I think those would apply to this question. Do you want to add anything to that, Deborah?
Yeah, the manual by its nature deals with FERPA in a more general manner. Unfortunately, we didn't have the space to get into the nitty-gritty of those kinds of details about the law. And this is, in fact, an area where the advice of legal counsel would be helpful, because how a system deals with directory information is a decision that has to be made by the school board in light of FERPA and with the advice of their legal counsel. But we, given that the information we provide in the manual is a starting point, of course, we're always available to help both public and school and private librarians with specific questions like this about the law, about policy, about best practice by simply calling the office. We're very happy to help, and we try to make ourselves available as much as possible to do this and to consult with libraries on these specific questions about the law or about the policy and procedure issues involved with these things.
All right, the next question that we have is from Minnie. She's an MLIS student in Canada. How applicable do you say this book is for Canadian library and information practitioners?
Thanks for your question, Minnie. I guess I would say that the legal essays obviously are not going to be of much application for you. However, all of the information that sort of deals with best practices, I think, will be of use. And the principles of why intellectual freedom matters, how it impacts people's ability to access information and to sustain a democracy. I think all of that applies. So I think you'll find plenty of content in there that will be useful.
If I can add a note here, Barbara Jones, the director of the Office for Intellectual Freedom, and I actually did put together an intellectual freedom workshop for the Toronto Public Library as staff development, and we found that the principles very much translated across the border, so to speak, as ethical imperatives and examples of good practice, irregardless of U.S. law being drawn on for the principles, because intellectual freedom, the right to free expression, is really has no borders, and we found, and it was great talking about collection development issues and challenges, because of course challenges occur in Canada as well. But the guidance for dealing with a challenge and addressing the concerns of a library user, raising questions about a resource, are not bound by law, but can be very useful for librarians in all kinds of situations.
And I think, too, the information about communication and lobbying and building allies and coalitions that appears at the end of the book, that would also be very useful for you.
All right, do we have more questions?
Oh, I think I see one here. What about church use of meeting rooms? That's a great question, Carolyn. We have a chapter in the book called The Law Regarding Access to Meeting Rooms and Exhibit Spaces, because that's been a big question for librarians. So that question is grappled with in that chapter.
Yes. And it's very important to understand that, because it's one of the hotbeds of a number of libraries have been sued within the last half decade on they're denying access to religious organizations, and unfortunately the libraries tend to lose these lawsuits. So it's important to understand the law and the principles behind the law when you're drawing up meeting room policy.
I would also draw your attention to the Q&A document that's available on the ALA website that talks specifically about religion and public libraries, and the meeting room question is gone into in greater detail.
Yes, thanks, Martin and Deborah, both.
We have a question from Barbara. Can anyone on the panel recall a situation when ALA OIF was not able to successfully defend a challenge?
So I wonder, does that question mean, in other words, the book was removed or the material was removed from the library?
Well, this is Deborah Stone. I can talk about a challenge that took place in Stockton, Missouri. The challenge was against the Absolutely True Diary of a Part-Time Indian. And despite the best efforts of the teachers in the high school, the librarian in the high school, and a parents group, the school board still voted to remove the book from the curriculum. As far as we know, that's still the status quo. That said, I have to say that we support librarians and community members who are fighting challenges, but ultimately it's the librarian, the teacher, the community members who are the ones on the ground working to address the challenge. We can provide you with tools, we can provide you with support and help and information that you need to do this successfully. We do write letters of support and things, but we're ultimately, we know that what we're doing is cheerleading for the librarians who are doing the actual work on the ground, and so we'll do everything we can to give you the tools you need to successfully address a challenge.
I think we have time for maybe one more question. Does anyone have another one? All right, maybe not. These are great questions, a great chance to talk about what's available in the way of help and resources. So I just want to wrap up in closing and just remind you of all the wonderful new features of the new edition with its topical arrangement, its checklist, its policy statements, legal essays, guidance for handling challenges and requests from law enforcement. Lots of good content for school librarians. And a reminder again that the historical content is going to be published in a separate book that you will likely want to check out as well. So the manual is useful not just for librarians, but there's lots of information in here that will be great for your administrators and board members and volunteers. And the book's also really a must-have for educators and scholars as well. So we also want to just finish by doing our giveaway of the free manual. Kristen, can you help with that?
I was so worried. We were wrapping up and everybody was starting to say goodbye, and I'm like,
Oh,
no,
no,
you have to be present in order to get the manual. So I hope I'm not gonna mispronounce your name. The lucky winner of our manual today is Deborah Stombres, S-T-O-M-B-R-E-S, Deborah Stombres. I will be sending you an email, but I need you to connect with me and we will get your mailing address and get you a copy. Someone did ask about the discount code applying to the history volume. Robert, I don't know on that for sure, but I will find out and get back to you.
Well, thanks everybody for being here today to talk about this important resource with us. Thanks for all of the presenters and contributors to the manual. I really appreciate your being here too. And please stay in touch with us if you have questions or if you have ideas for the next edition. It's never too early to start collecting those. So good luck to everybody as you work to try to protect intellectual freedom. Have a great afternoon.